Millions of men and women have supported, fought, and sacrificed on the battlefields that created and continue to define the United States of America. Generations of Americans owe their security, prosperity, freedom to what happened on these hallowed grounds, beginning more than 250 years ago. During the 17th and early 18th century, British colonists faced a constant struggle to establish control over the Atlantic coast and create and defend colonial settlements from Georgia to modern-day Maine through diplomacy and armed conflict with Native Americans. At the same time, a smaller number of French colonists carve out a domain amidst the Great Lakes, along the St. Lawrence River, and west of the Appalachian Mountains. By the middle of the 18th century, both sides lay claim to the area surrounding the head of the Ohio River. Soon, open conflict flares into war. Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie sends George Washington as part of a small colonial force to assert British control of the area around the Forks of Ohio. Fighting begins in 1754 with British victory at the Battle of Jumonville Glen. The arrival of more French troops, however, forced Washington to surrender at Fort Necessity. The following year, General Edward Braddock leads a force of British regulars toward the forks of the Ohio. But his troops lose the Battle of the Monongahela, in which Braddock is killed. Fighting soon sprawls across land known today as Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New York. What started as a war in the backwoods soon spreads like wildfire across the globe. French forces hold the upper hand in North America. Through growing distrust and French encouragement, the Cherokee break their alliance with the British. Open war follows in 1759. Raids and skirmishes engulf North Carolina, South Carolina, and modern-day Tennessee. In 1760, the British send a massive army into Cherokee territory that destroys crops and towns, ending Cherokee resistance for a time. British naval forces prevail over the French fleet in several battles, while increasing numbers of well-trained and well-equipped British forces arrive in North America. These forces turn the tide, and British victories follow. In 1759, the British win the Battle of Quebec. Within a year, outmanned and outfought, French forces surrender all of Canada. With the Treaty of Paris formally ending the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, England takes control of Canada and the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. To protect and control their larger domain, the royal government enacts rules and tax policies to pay war debts and raise money for troops who arrive in the colonies to protect their new territory. But the policies anger many colonists and fuel growing anti-British sentiment. Discontent among colonists grows. King George III sends troops to the colonies to maintain order. But in March 1770, one of these detachments fires into a crowd of Boston protesters, killing 5 and setting colonists and the Crown on an even more violent path. On April 19, 1775, American militiamen at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, resist a British force searching for an American arms cache and inflict a stinging defeat on the Redcoats. British troops limp back to Boston, followed by militiamen who surround the city. Soon after, the Green Mountain Boys seize Fort Ticonderoga along with a vast trove of artillery. Back in Boston, British forces win a costly tactical victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But the Patriot militia fight valiantly. American morale soars. A decade of tension flares into open war. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress prepares for war, giving command of a new Continental Army to General George Washington. Washington works to create an effective army out of the militia forces surrounding Boston. Henry Knox directs the movement of the captured artillery from Fort Ticonderoga to the heights above Boston. The British, fearing a bombardment, evacuate the city. Sensing the next British target would be New York City, Washington moves his army there and fortifies. British leadership in the South encourages their Cherokee allies to go on the offensive. The offensive fails, and colonial militia retaliate, destroying dozens of Cherokee towns. Cherokee leaders sue for peace and cede huge parcels of land to the colonists. In the North, Native Americans, known as the Six Nations, declare neutrality, but British envoys demand they fight against the colonists. Some refuse, but the majority side with the British and attack Americans across the New York and Pennsylvania frontier. Meanwhile, as the issuance of the Declaration of Independence changes the nature of the war, British troops in the North go on the offensive near New York City. They beat the Americans in the Battle of Brooklyn. A thick fog sets in that covers the Americans' retreat across the East River onto Manhattan Island. The British troops land on Manhattan Island and in a series of battles push Washington's army into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Washington's exhausted army is reduced to some 2,500 men and teeters on the edge of collapse. These are the times that try men's souls, pens a revolutionary writer. Washington regroups his men and wins stunning victories at Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey. In 1777, the British hope to separate New England from the rest of the colonies. They target the key transportation center of Albany, New York, ordering 3 separate forces to converge on the city. The first force marches from the west, but comes up short at Fort Stanwix. A second force is supposed to advance from the south, but the commander ignores the plan and instead moves toward Philadelphia. Washington tries to defend the capital, but is beaten at the Battle of Brandywine. British troops capture the American capital. Washington regroups and attacks the British at Germantown near Philadelphia. The attack fails, but Washington moves into a winter encampment at Valley Forge with more experience under his belt. In keeping with the pattern from earlier conflicts, female camp followers make key contributions to the Continental force by performing vital tasks in the camps. A third British force, coming from Canada, engages American forces near Saratoga, New York. A month of fighting and maneuvering follows, ending when Americans win a stunning victory by surrounding the British and forcing their surrender. The French see better prospects of American victory in the war and form an alliance with the United States. The French Navy forces the British to abandon Philadelphia. As the Redcoats march toward New York City, Washington attacks at Monmouth, New Jersey, standing toe-to-toe with the British. British troops continue to New York, and Washington puts constant pressure on the garrison. Frequent skirmishing crackles across New Jersey. Frustrated by the lack of progress in the North, the British move southward, enticed by valuable agricultural resources and the belief that Southerners were still loyal to the Crown. They capture Savannah, Georgia, and then march on Charleston, South Carolina in 1780. The 5,000 American defenders hold out, but finally surrender. Their defeat leaves the South almost defenseless. American reinforcements hurry to South Carolina. At Camden, British troops crush an American force, but Patriot militiamen annihilate a Loyalist column at Kings Mountain. American Continentals and militia smash the British at the Battle of Cowpens. American maneuvering exhausts the British. After the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, most British forces retreat to Wilmington, North Carolina, and then depart for Virginia to await reinforcements and a new offensive. American troops attack the remaining British forces in South Carolina and fight to a draw at Eutaw Springs. The remaining British withdraw to Charleston. With the opportunity to trap the British at Yorktown, Continental and French forces moved to Virginia. The French Navy drives away the British fleet. Besieged and cut off from reinforcements, the British Army surrenders on October 19, 1781. Parliament suspends offensive operations. In 1783, yet another Treaty of Paris ends a war. This time, the Revolutionary War. The sovereignty of the United States of America is established. A treaty with the Six Nations cedes more land to the United States. International challenges arise quickly for the young republic. In 1785, the Barbary state of Algiers declares war on the United States. American vessels are captured and forced to make ransom payments. Meanwhile, Americans create a new constitution that helps provide new political stability and improves American ability to organize military forces. Congress authorizes the construction of new warships that will make the United States a naval power capable of protecting its vital interests around the world. Revolution in France begins in 1789. Locked in war with Britain, the French revolutionary government calls for American support. But President George Washington steers the United States toward neutrality. This diplomatic crisis edges into an undeclared or quasi-war in 1796, when the French attack American merchant ships. President John Adams employs the nation's growing naval forces for defense and establishes an independent Navy and Marine Corps. Americans score a pair of victories, and the quasi-war ends with the Treaty of Montfortain in 1800. In 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli declares war on the United States. American Marines land in Egypt, march on the shores of Tripoli and, aided by a naval bombardment, rout the Barbary force. A treaty ends yet another American conflict, for now. More than a decade later, the Dey of Algiers declares war on the United States. Stephen Decatur's American Navy squadron defeats the Algerian fleet. He then threatens Tunis and Tripoli, ending the Barbary Wars. All the while, the British seize property on American ships, impress American sailors, and arm Native Americans to fight American settlers. Diplomacy fails to resolve these issues. In 1812, President James Madison asks Congress to declare war. An American invasion of Canada in 1812 fails with a demoralizing American defeat at Queenston Heights. American forces lose the Battle of River Raisin and falter in a second invasion of Canada. But on the high seas, American frigates such as the USS Constitution and privateers stand toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy. American victories at Sackett's Harbor and on Lake Erie keep the British away from New York and Michigan. General William Henry Harrison follows up with an American victory at the Battle of the Thames. British troops strike back with an advance on Montreal at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm and then capture Fort Niagara. In 1814, General Andrew Jackson ends a short but bloody war with Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Jackson's victory and his subsequent rise to political power marks more territorial conquest and the westward removal of native people. In the north, Americans again move into Canada in June, winning the Battle of Chippewa, but withdraw 3 weeks later after fighting to a draw at Lundy's Lane. British troops shatter an American force at Bladensburg and set Washington, D.C. to the torch. With the rockets' red glare and bombs bursting in air, the British attack Fort McHenry at Baltimore. The bombardment fails. The American flag is still there, and the British land force lacks support. Peace negotiations begin soon. Unaware of diplomatic matters, the British unsuccessfully assault Jackson's forces at New Orleans in early 1815. Their defeat and the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812. Decades of conflict establish America's national legitimacy, its place in the international order, and as a power in the Western Hemisphere. But new challenges arise as the nation pushes to expand its boundaries. On the southern frontier, fighting flares with the Seminole Indians. A force led by General Andrew Jackson pushes them south and establishes a tense peace. Jackson becomes president in 1828 and works for the passage of the Indian Removal Act. The act orders Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River to move to Indian Territory by 1838. American forces mobilize while some natives prepare resistance. In the Illinois Territory, militia troops defeat the Sauk Indians in the Black Hawk War. Future President Abraham Lincoln is among the militiamen. Continuing Seminole resistance to removal policies sparks a fierce war between 1835 and 1842. In other areas, most notably in the Cherokee Nation, the presence of the Army is enough to enforce compliance. In the west, Mexico gains independence from Spain. Hoping to populate the northern section of the new nation, Mexican officials invite American settlers in. Given great autonomy and the right to own slaves, thousands of Americans flood into the territory. Afraid of losing control, the Mexican government exerts more authority over the region and outlaws the importation of slaves. Angry Americans call for independence. Mexico organizes an army to subdue the Texans in late 1835. Fighting breaks out at San Antonio Bay, resulting in a siege that ends in victory for the Texans. At the same time, even more Americans come into the region, this time to fight for Texas independence. They gather at Goliad under command of Sam Houston. General Santa Anna's Mexican army advances and wins a small battle before advancing on and besieging a force of Texans who use the old Alamo mission as a fortification. The Mexicans attack and take no prisoners, but Americans remember the Alamo. Mexicans and Texans next clash at the Battle of Refugio. The Texans try to retreat but fall captive. Mexican troops execute 340 prisoners in the Goliad massacre. Infuriated Texans, led by Sam Houston, counterattack the Mexicans at San Jacinto. The battle is short and ends in a resounding victory for Houston's troops, who avenge the men killed at the Alamo and Goliad. Texas becomes independent, but Mexican resentment and hostility remains. In 1845, Congress approves the annexation of Texas and sets the Rio Grande as the new international boundary. A clash along the Rio Grande leads Congress to declare war in 1846. Multiple campaigns ensue. Troops under General Zachary Taylor invade northern Mexico and win the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Naval forces fight the Battle of Yerba Buena, capturing what becomes San Francisco. In New Mexico, Stephen Kearny wins the Battle of Conocito and occupies Santa Fe. After battles at San Pascual, Rio San Gabriel, and La Mesa, Kearny takes Los Angeles. Taylor chalks up more wins at Monterrey and Buena Vista. But Taylor opposes a major invasion of Mexico and fails to pursue the Mexican army. General Winfield Scott is ordered to prosecute the war more aggressively. He besieges Veracruz, moves inland, and defeats the Mexicans at Cerro Gordo. In these and other battles, future generals Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and other American soldiers gain key military experience. In the summer of 1847, Scott advances toward Mexico City, fighting at Contreras, Churubusco, Molino del Rey, and Chapultepec, where Marines stormed the halls of Montezuma. Scott's capture of Mexico City decisively ends the Mexican-American War. This conflict stretches American sovereignty from sea to shining sea, while conflicts in the vast territories lead to increasing tension over Western expansion and the politics of slavery. As Americans move westward, the Army builds a series of forts to protect the nation's borders and settlers. Tensions build over who will govern the new territories and how they will be governed. Mormon settlers in the Utah Territory push for the appointment of a territorial governor of their own choosing. President James Buchanan sends troops to enforce territorial policy. A dramatic confrontation pits Mormon militia against American troops, led by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, but ends bloodlessly in compromise. Compromise seems impossible in the Kansas Territory, where violent confrontations sweep the land. The new doctrine of popular sovereignty draws pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates into the region. Both sides try to control the organization of the new territorial government. Bitter violence and a largely unorganized guerrilla war engulfs bleeding Kansas. Radical abolitionist John Brown moves eastward and attempts to spark a slave uprising based at the U.S. Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown and his small group of insurgents capture the arsenal, but the plan unravels. He and his men are trapped in the town's fire engine house. A group of Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, attacks the holdouts and kills or captures them. A wounded John Brown is found guilty of murder, inciting a slave rebellion, and treason against Virginia. Before his hanging, he predicts that the sins of the nation will only be purged away with blood. The raid convinces many Southerners that their lives and their way of life are in danger. The South militarizes. Civil war looms. The conflict over slavery explodes in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. South Carolina secedes and 6 Deep South states follow, forming the Confederacy. In April 1861, Confederate forces bombard Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The fort surrenders, and Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to subdue the rebellion and restore the Union. 4 more Southern states join the Confederacy. Both sides prepare for a longer war. Fighting breaks out across the nation at Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Ball's Bluff, Port Royal, and elsewhere. A Union victory at Mill Springs initiates a string of Northern strategic successes. General Ulysses Grant captures Forts Henry and Donelson, opening key water routes into the South. Another victory at Pea Ridge establishes Union control of Missouri. Naval forces bring much of the Mississippi River under Union control, while coastal operations tighten the Union naval blockade. Grant uses the Tennessee River to drive into southern Tennessee. Confederates deliver a furious counterattack at Shiloh. But Grant regroups and drives the rebels back. Federal forces target the strategic rail center at Corinth, Mississippi. In the east, General George McClellan lands his Army of the Potomac in Virginia and advances up the peninsula toward the Confederate capital at Richmond. Confederates counterattack at Seven Pines, stopping Union momentum. But Southern Commander General Joseph E. Johnston falls wounded. General Robert E. Lee takes command and drives McClellan away from Richmond in the 7 days battles. Lee's forces advance northward, winning at Cedar Mountain and 2nd Manassas. Lee crosses into Maryland. McClellan follows, seizing the initiative at South Mountain. Lee captures a large force of Union soldiers at Harper's Ferry. Soon after, near Sharpsburg, McClellan pushes the rebels beyond a cornfield from a sunken road and away from Burnside Bridge. But Lee stands his ground in the Battle of Antietam. Once Lee retreats, President Lincoln forecasts the Emancipation Proclamation, keeping anti-slavery European countries out of the conflict, and eventually enlisting more than 200,000 black men. Confederate Generals Braxton Bragg and Kirby Smith invade Kentucky, fighting at Richmond, Munfordville, and later at Perryville. Bragg, facing supply and other problems, falls back to Tennessee. As 1862 draws to a close, General William T. Sherman fails at Chickasaw Bayou near Vicksburg, but Union forces under General Rosecrans barely hold on against Bragg at the Battle of Stones River. General Ambrose Burnside is bloodied by Lee's forces in front of a stone wall at Fredericksburg, while gains at the Slaughter Pit Farm are temporary. That spring, General Joseph Hooker takes command and goes on the offensive, but Lee outflanks and outfights him at Chancellorsville. That spring and summer, multiple campaigns unfold. Lee pushes into Pennsylvania, hoping to end the war. At Gettysburg, Confederates win the first day, make some gains on the second, and are bloodily repulsed in Pickett's charge on the third. The Union Army's new commander, General George Meade, wins the largest battle of the war. Meanwhile, Grant finally traps Confederate forces at Vicksburg, Mississippi. A siege follows, and the Confederate Army, under John C. Pemberton, surrenders on July 4th. At Tullahoma, General Rosecrans outmaneuvers Bragg, forcing the rebels nearly out of the state. In South Carolina, some of the first black troops of the war famously attack but are repulsed at Fort Wagner, near Charleston. Rosecrans advances and captures Chattanooga. Bragg retreats again. Reinforced, he attacks and routs Union troops at the massive Battle of Chickamauga. General George Thomas helps to prevent complete disaster as the Rock of Chickamauga, and Rosecrans holds Chattanooga. Grant takes command and wins multiple battles there. The Confederates fall back into Georgia. Lincoln travels to Gettysburg to deliver an address that links the future of government of, by, and for the people to Union victory in the Civil War. Though the expectations of the time imply that they stay home from battle, women on both sides mobilize to support the war, playing vital roles as nurses, volunteers, and sometimes even as spies. In the spring of 1864, the Army of the Potomac attacks at the Wilderness. Though stymied, Grant, unlike past commanders, moves ahead. Vicious fighting at Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor follows. Grant traps Lee at Petersburg and lays siege. Mirroring Grant, Sherman attacks Joseph E. Johnston's Confederates in Georgia. Battles erupt at Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca, and at Kennesaw Mountain, where a major federal attack fails. Undeterred, Sherman continues southward. By July, he threatens to encircle Atlanta. General John B. Hood replaces Johnston and launches 3 failed attacks. Sherman lays siege while Union forces dam the torpedoes and capture Mobile Bay, then lash out at Confederates in the Shenandoah Valley. Atlanta surrenders soon after. With few options left, Hood moves toward Tennessee. Sherman launches his march to the sea, reaching Savannah in December. Hood fights a desperate and costly battle at Franklin, and then is routed at Nashville. In 1865, a small Confederate force contests Sherman's advance through the Carolinas. Fighting at Averysboro and Bentonville do no more than annoy Sherman. After several attempts, Grant breaks Lee's Petersburg lines. The Confederate capital at Richmond falls as Lee flees westward. Grant pursues, crushing a last-ditch effort at Sailor's Creek. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Confederate forces in North Carolina and elsewhere surrender soon after. The Union is restored. Constitutional amendments free the slaves. Secession is deemed unconstitutional. And an uneasy and sometimes deadly period of healing ensues. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad creates new missions. The Army, bolstered by regiments of black Buffalo soldiers, reoccupies forts it had abandoned during the Civil War to protect railroad crews and settlers moving west. New forts emerge along the Union Pacific Railroad. The Army also launches 2 major campaigns to exert control in the West. In the Southern Plains, the Red River War between the Comanche and the United States begins in 1874 at the Battle of Adobe Walls. 20 small battles follow until the Comanche surrender in 1875. In the Northern Plains, Americans and native warriors clash in Reynolds' campaign. After the Battle of the Rosebud, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and much of his force are defeated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Fighting continues into 1877 at the Dull Knife Fight and at Wolf Mountain. Defeated on the battlefield, the Sioux agree to go to reservations, which ends military resistance in the Northern Plains. In the early 1880s, the Army consolidates forts into a ring of guardian forts that aim to keep Indians on their reservations. The following decade, the military frontier in the West closes, and the Army's presence reduces dramatically. As the internal military frontier shrinks, Americans are increasingly concerned with the economic and political instability in Spanish-controlled Cuba. Many support the Cuban revolutionaries who seek independence. Brutal Spanish tactics infuriate the public. Anti-Spanish sentiment soars. When the U.S. battleship Maine explodes and sinks in Havana Harbor under mysterious circumstances in 1898, the U.S. prepares for military action. On May 1st, naval forces under Admiral George Dewey defeat the Spanish Pacific Fleet in Manila Bay, Philippines, establishing America as a world naval power. American troops land in Cuba and win the decisive Battle of San Juan Hill. 3 days later, the Navy attacks and destroys the fleeing Spanish fleet. The splendid little war has ended, and yet another Treaty of Paris makes peace between the United States and the Kingdom of Spain. Despite its brevity and relatively few casualties, the war changes the international order. The Spanish colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere ends. Cuba becomes independent, and Puerto Rico becomes an American dependency. American victory over Spanish naval forces in the Philippines, which had been a part of the Spanish Empire, establishes the U.S. as a Pacific power. Challenges in the Pacific arise almost immediately. Though initially allies with the U.S. against the Spanish, the Philippine people desire independence rather than the territorial status granted under the recent peace treaty. In 1899, a skirmish between Philippine nationalists and U.S. troops sparks a war. U.S. troops drive Filipino forces from Manila and crush a revolt in the city. 30 or more small engagements lead to the near defeat of nationalist forces. Filipinos switch to guerrilla tactics. Thousands of small engagements follow. Nationalist troops surrender in 1902. Tensions along the U.S.-Mexican border rise in the early 20th century. Revolution in Mexico destabilizes the border. Raids across the border spike, while Texas Rangers and the U.S. Army try to stabilize the situation. In 1916, Pancho Villa's guerrillas murder 16 American miners. Villa's troops attack Columbus, New Mexico, but U.S. cavalry troops counterattack and scatter Villa's force. 12,000 American troops under General John Pershing crossed the border to disrupt the guerrillas' operations. President Woodrow Wilson, sensing that the U.S. would likely be drawn into the war in Europe, uses diplomacy to settle border issues. American military planners prepare for a larger conflict abroad. While years-long war rages in Europe, the Wilson administration maintains a policy of strict neutrality. Even so, many Americans support the British and French side in the war. German U-boat attacks on ships in the Atlantic harden public opinion against Germany. An attack on the RMS Lusitania in 1915 kills 128 Americans, and the U.S. demands a stop to the attacks. Hoping to apply pressure on the Allies and to break the naval blockade of Germany, the Imperial German Navy initiates unrestricted submarine warfare, and in 1917 sink the SS Aztec, killing 28 Americans. News breaks of a plot to bring Mexico into alliance with Germany. Via the Zimmermann telegram, Germans promised to return territory lost in the Mexican War. America declares war. American troops, some of whom had been trained on battlefields of past American conflicts, begin to take the field in France. Major American combat operations begin in 1918 with the Battle of Cantigny. American troops employ a synchronized operation of infantry, artillery, tank, engineer, and aviation forces. The capture and defense of the town shows the value of integrated combat and displays the abilities of American troops. Marines attack Belleau Wood. The fighting is costly, but American fighting capacity and readiness give them victory again. Germany launches an offensive aimed at ending the war before American power tips the strategic balance, but the attack grinds to a halt. American troops play a key role in a massive counterattack at Aisne-Marne. The victory changes the war's dynamic, and the Germans are unable to resume offensive operations. The infantry, tank, and air attacks in the first American-led offensive of the war drives German troops back from the salient between Verdun and Nancy. Pershing moves his army, and American troops plunge into the decisive Meuse-Argonne offensive. Fierce fighting through October results in little progress, with staggering casualties. But soon, American attacks pulverize German positions, and the advance speeds up. An armistice is declared, and combat comes to an end. Peace talks drag into 1919. The Treaty of Versailles formally ends the Great War and includes a League of Nations that can act diplomatically to solve international conflicts. President Wilson supports it, but Congress rejects it and rejects the multilateral peace treaty. In 1921, the U.S. concludes a separate treaty with Germany and hopes for lasting peace. In 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. The United States attempts to remain neutral, but close relations with England and France and broad opposition to Nazi Germany's aggression makes it difficult to avoid the conflict. The United States provides supplies to the Allies and prepares the Selective Service to mobilize American soldiers in the event of war. The Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on the infamous day of December 7, 1941, inflames Americans and results in a declaration of war on Japan. Days later, Japan's Axis partners, Nazi Germany and Italy, declare war on the United States. The U.S. allies with England, the Soviet Union, and China. American women take on even more than they had in World War I, some with broader roles as doctors, uniformed army and naval forces, and factory workers. American efforts begin in the Pacific. In 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle leads a bombing raid on Tokyo, Japan. Though largely symbolic, the effort encourages the American people. Despite this morale boost, the U.S. faces an uphill battle to turn the tide in the Pacific. At Midway, a dramatic American victory cripples the Japanese Navy and set the Americans on a path to success. With sometimes terrible consequences, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps and their allies chip away at Japanese-controlled islands in the Philippines and East Indies. They employ an island-hopping strategy that avoids easily defended places and focuses on capturing critical islands to isolate larger Japanese garrisons. Meanwhile, the Navy fights 14 surface battles that support the ground troops. Army Air Force and Marine aviators provide air support, with Coast Guard sailors crewing many landing craft. Across the globe, B-17s of the Army Air Force strike the first American blow in Europe in a raid on the Soudeville-Les-Rouen Railroad. American ground forces entered the war against Germany and Italy along the North African coast. U.S. forces land at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers in Morocco. Heavy fighting in Tunisia ends in victory for American and British forces. Following success in North Africa, American troops seize Sicily and move on to the Italian peninsula at Salerno. American troops land at Anzio in 1944. They achieve total surprise, but fail to capitalize. Germans take a strong position, leading to months of brutal fighting. U.S. troops break out of their beachhead and move on to capture Rome. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Americans land on the western coast of France, opening a new front. Once fighting forces secure a beachhead, engineers establish a complex of docks and supply infrastructure to support offensive operations inland. After weeks of stalemate, the Allies break out of the Normandy beachhead in late July. While American and Allied troops push forward in northern France, another force lands and advances in the south. Some predict the war in Europe will be over before Christmas. In the Allied High Command, leaders clash over exactly how to finish the war. They opt to outflank the Siegfried Line in Operation Market Garden. The attack fails. It was a bridge too far. But attacks continue, trying to push the German army to a breaking point. Though on the defensive for the second half of 1944, the Germans attempt to turn the tide by launching a major offensive in the heavily forested Ardennes. Helped by low clouds and fog that kept planes grounded, the German attack is initially successful. But stout resistance by American troops in the Battle of the Bulge blunts the onslaught. As the weather clears, Allied forces counterattack. After stabilizing their lines, Allied forces begin a final push toward Berlin. German resistance begins to crumble. Nazi Germany surrenders. As the war in Europe grinds to an end, American troops close in on Japan. It's grueling, bloody, and terrifying, but fighting on the tropical islands steadily favors the Americans. American troops fight for the Mariana Islands while supporting forces advance in New Guinea. In support of a ground campaign that cuts Japanese supplies, American and Australian naval forces attack the Japanese at Leyte Gulf. It is the largest naval battle in history. A months-long campaign in Luzon further constricts Japanese supplies. Fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa position American troops for a final attack on the Japanese mainland. At the same time, American leaders prepare to invade Japan's home islands. Predictions of massive casualties lead American leaders to resort to atomic weapons in order to bring the war to a quick end. Little Boy, the first atomic bomb, explodes over Hiroshima, but stunned Japanese leaders refuse to surrender. Soon after, an American B-29 drops Fat Man, the second atomic bomb, on Nagasaki. Japanese leaders announced surrender on August 15, 1945. World War II is over. A long recovery process begins. The veterans that fought these wars returned home and resumed their lives as best one can after witnessing such bloodshed. A handful of the first Americans to fight in war lived long enough to be photographed before passing away. Since then, their generation has been followed by others, having passed away and taken their living memories with them. Through smoke, fire, and blood, they have forged a new world and new births of freedom. They are united in the belief that their achievements should be remembered, their battlegrounds preserved, and their stories told.